I have clicked on that, waiting for municipality. Do I need a password or anything for it?
No, and I think
Oh, there you go.
we just went live.
Now I see.
Just went live. Great. All right, we're ready to go. Can we ask him to mute until we turn?
And then can you, Dusty, can you mute until we ask your question? Thanks.
100%, yes.
So, good morning, everybody, or now I guess it's noon. Today is the 19th of January, 2024. This is a work session regarding AO 2023-110, an ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly, amending Anchorage Municipal Code Title 10 to add a new chapter for the licensing and regulation of short-term rental operations in the municipality and amending AMC Section 14.60.030, the municipal fine schedule, to add corresponding fines. Let's do introduction, starting with Mr. Johnson.
Zach Johnson.
Daniel Boland.
Kevin Cross.
Scott Myers.
Anna Brawley. Meg Zalatel.
Christopher Constant.
George Martinez.
So that's all the members on the phone. Is Mr. Salt there?
I'm here.
Okay, there we can hear you. Okay, so I'll hand this one off to the sponsors.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This ordinance is sponsored by myself and Mr. Soltz. The intention here is to do licensing and registration of short-term rental operations. We really want to talk to you today about the S version. The S version is the result of us taking in considerable community comments since the original was proposed, as well as getting feedback from the clerk's office on licensing, and then working with council on the various components of putting together a registration and licensing scheme. We have a short PowerPoint that really highlights what's in the S. Then it's our intention to, which Mr. Solt is going to present, then it's our intention to turn to a guest we have, I believe, on the phone from Airbnb. And then finally, we are going to turn to Dustin, who is online, which is from a third-party verification platform, which can be used for compliance. And he has a short presentation. That should leave us, if we stay within our time parameters, about 20 minutes for questions at the end when you have the full package of information before you. That doesn't mean we're not open to questions as we go. We just want to make sure we get through these three component parts. With that, Mr. Solt, the PowerPoint is up. You'll just have to let us know when to advance to the next slide. Thank you.
Okay, great. Appreciate this, and I appreciate all the hard work on this with Meg, Dean, Jennifer, and a lot of community involvement that we've gotten emails and from various owners who have given us a lot of input on how to make this better ordinance. So the goals of the ordinance, slide 2, are to safeguard property and neighborhood values, so protect the renter as well as the rentee, to make sure that both have quiet, peaceful enjoyment of the area. A net zero licensing fee, so we just want to cover the cost of the licensing program and not view it or use it as an additional tax. And then lastly, we want to collect data. And the reason we want to collect data is to see if the impact of short-term rentals on our market, to see if it is a problem and to prevent it from becoming a problem that we see in other areas within the United States. Slide 3, legislative history. So the differences between the original version and the S version. We did change the annual license fee. It is $200 for 1 year or $400 for 2 years. So there was a clerical error there. There will be a floor amendment correcting that to bring that back in line with our intent. The license will be issued to property owners. So it is not transferable, only in special cases, divorce, things like that. But it's meant to stay with the property owner, not the property, not to be unreasonably withheld. We're not putting limitations on the number. So if you sell a property with a short-term rental and the new owner wants to do the same, the new owner just simply needs to apply for a permit. We are going to require insurance, which a lot of the platforms require insurance. And if your home is insured, your insurance provider typically requires you to have a renter's or a short-term rental type insurance. And that is available out there. Again, that protects the renter as well as the owner of the facility. We made some changes to the on-call manager and or alternate. Our initial goal here was to provide immediate response and to ensure we don't have absent owners. So you remember we had a 1 hour response requirement. We've loosened that up to say you'll be available 24/7. You can respond within a day, 24 hours. And that response could be phone, email, etc. One of the reasons we had the 1 hour piece in there was, if you have a service, a party, or a noise violation, the APD has better things to do. They're not going to respond in time. And but if they do respond to the next morning when the party's long gone, so we want the owner to respond. And I believe, again, we're feeling that most owners will respond promptly to any issue, but we're giving them a window to do that within, so holding it to an hour.
Mr. Solt,
What that was on, yes.
before you move on, I wanted to add on the response time. A lot of the platforms actually indicate what an owner's response time is anyway, in terms of to an inquiry. And so we're kind of utilizing some of the things built in, right? A quicker response time. They respond to not only reservation inquiries, but also it's an aggregate amount for any response. We really want to be able to rely on platform complaint resolution, but we need there to be someone live and in the community that can respond to a complaint or an issue that's happening within a day so that it doesn't persist or go unremedied. This is really a lesson learned that I asked that we could have a conversation about from alcohol licenses. We would have alcohol licensee holders that were out of state and no one local to respond, and those snowballed. And so that's really the intention here. Thanks, Mr. Solt.
Thank you. And yes, the online platform, the major platforms, the Airbnb that we hear from later, do a great job of managing the owner of the property through feedback. They're getting better at managing the renters or the neighbors' feedback. And we want to keep that moving forward. So effective 120 days after passage. So we worked with the clerk's office and basically relied on their recommendation to timeframe, which they can get this implemented in. So we move on to key components. First, we want to implement an SCR license program. And again, that's to gather the data. There's people that are renting out there that don't use major platforms, don't use any platform, as well as we're hearing the data from the major platforms is considered proprietary and is handled in bulk, so we don't see the original owners. Again, including a modest license fee to cover the cost of the program. We're starting out at $200. If we find, or I should say, if the clerk office finds that that's an excess to manage the program, they will adjust. But we definitely want to avoid going negative at any time, so there'll probably be some balance in there to maintain the program. Enforce public safety requirements, and a lot of these requirements we know won't get immediate response, but at the end of the day, we have that sort of poison pill with the ability to pull a permit or a bad owner, which I hope we don't run into. I expect to be less than 1% of the renter of the owner population. And then lastly, we'll empower the clerk to manage the licensing as they do for other licensing programs. Moving on to the next slide, municipal clerk responsibilities. So programs, we're going to leverage existing licensing programs, and we'll hear later from Dustin about some platforms, their platforms to help manage these programs, and a lot of them are very slick, minimal effort, mostly done online, to be accomplished rather quickly. Fees, again, the fee evaluates program costs and fee amount annually, and we'll recommend fee adjustment to the assembly, and the assembly will have the final say on what that fee becomes, whether it goes up or down or what's implemented. And then terms, we will evaluate and readjust license terms. We initially came this with a 1-year license and we extended to 2 years. We are going with an annual renewal date, and that would again through the recommendation of the clerk's office versus having a rolling renewal. Go on to the next slide, fees and fines. There is a $400 biannual fee, be $200 for 1 year. Waived if the owner lives on site or an adjacent property. We also waived if they rent to a single renter for greater than 180 days, which essentially is a long-term renter. And we are evaluating waiving for owners that live on the property greater than 180 days and rent for approximately 14 days. And that may be someone that leaves over Christmas, over the holidays, and rents out their property. There are also some municipalities that waive during certain events, which are high income periods for owners. For example, if the Super Bowl happens to be in your city, you can make quite a bit of money renting your house out for a week. So they rent it for a week and go on vacation. We're looking at possibly waiving that. More to come.
So on the,
There'll be tiered funds. Go ahead.
yeah, thank you, Mr. Solt. So the 14 days, so if you just rent throughout the calendar year and you're otherwise considered to be an occupied homeowner, that's consistent with IRS rules. And so we thought we should be consistent with the IRS. That's income that isn't required to be claimed for income tax purposes. Thanks.
Excellent. Thank you. There will be a tiered fines for code violation, warning, $100 and $300. Again, we hope to not get to that point. We hope it works out much like some of the other licensing programs where the owners self-regulate and the platform self-regulate. Obviously, if you run a bad Airbnb, you're not going to have renters. Next slide, responsible managers clause. The time restrictions I spoke to must be able to respond daily. And that is you or an agent acting on your behalf. Responsibilities can be handled by phone or other means, that's acceptable. However, it does not negate the requirement to be able to respond daily, not 1 hour away, because we know you could take more than an hour to get across the municipality. And then again, the alternate, you can have the flexibility for who responds as your manager. So you could have an absent owner that's out of state, but they would need to have a local manager. And that is all. So next, I'd like to turn it over to Danny Baldacci. Sorry if I lost your name, Danny Baldacci with Airbnb. And Dan, you have about 5 minutes. You want to talk about STR, Airbnb, and our ordinance.
You know, Henry?
Yes.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. And I appreciate some of the members meeting with me when I was in Anchorage a few months ago to talk about this. I appreciate the level of care that's gone into this. Just to introduce myself, I'm Danny Baldacci. I am on the public policy team for the US West at Airbnb. My job is effectively to advocate on behalf of our host community, basically offering, government, we're working with government for these folks who are, operating, using their assets to operate a business. So as far as the registration scheme goes, I think this is a very thoughtful approach to this. I don't see many issues in, prohibitive costs. I think the 2-year versus 4-year or 1 year versus 2 year option to renew with different fees is very thoughtful. I think a lot of this has been put together very well, and I have very few issues with this from an Airbnb perspective. In email communications through Assemblymember Stoltz, I believe Assemblymember Zoltel sent a few questions, just basically discussing, concerns for, I guess the more urban part of Anchorage versus Girdwood, and how we think about the interaction of housing and those two kinds of settings for a registration scheme. And I think it really comes down to what your perceived issue is, what your objective is. I think if it's a, nuisance, safety, street parking, kind of concern, I'm happy to collaborate with you all on that. If we're talking about, more how short-term rentals interplay with housing stock, I think there's a lot to be said there, and there's a lot of research. I would point you all to most recently, I think in Juneau, there was a pretty extensive study done of how short-term rentals impact the housing market. Not arguing that there was no impact, but there was a very clear connection between not building enough housing stock and the affordability crisis versus units being converted to short-term rental. If you don't mind, I will back that up with just a few statistics here. So of our hosts in Anchorage, I think the most telling number is that our hosts as of, and these numbers are going to be for all of the year 2022, our hosts average 60 nights on our platform Airbnb per year, which means, we're talking about 2 months of hosting, not an extreme length of time here. So the idea that somebody who hosts their property for 2 months sees it as an opportunity to travel elsewhere or make additional income or whatever the case may be, the idea that that person would then ultimately convert their property into long-term housing, I think is not a clear connection, as the study in Juneau found as well. 75% of hosts in Anchorage have a single listing. Nearly 20% of our hosts are over 60 years old and are incorporating the paying down of their mortgage or additional income towards their retirement on a fixed income. And I just wanted to end with the fact that we have a good, I believe, VCA voluntary collection agreement for your local taxes in Anchorage. And as of 2022, I believe, October 1st to September, October 1st of 2022 to September 30th of 23. So basically a full calendar year of that window. And I'm sorry for that strange month span, but we're a public company and I have to be a little bit careful with the exact numbers I share. But as of Q3 2023, we had remitted our hosts, on behalf of our hosts, we remitted $4.4 million to Anchorage from the green tax you all have. So our hosts, on behalf of our hosts, I appreciate your work on this issue. I'm happy to answer any other questions you may have if I have the answer to them or follow up with you after. But I appreciate your time.
So I have 2 questions. Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thank you. This is for the Airbnb person. Thanks for being here. I understand the housing market is complex, and part of the reason we want to measure short-term rentals is because we don't know exactly the impacts in our community. So thanks for the example from Juneau. I wonder if in your research in other cities or observations, how much have you seen that Airbnbs or other short-term rentals disrupt the year-round housing market? And I refer to the situation where somebody uses an Airbnb just in the summer. As you said, the average was 60 days. And so functionally, someone cannot rent a unit and they don't have a place to live or they have to move, which is not a year-round housing unit. So I wonder if you could comment on that briefly. And I recognize that is tangential to this, this ordinance, but I think it is relevant. Thanks.
I'm not sure how the 60 days would fully disrupt from somebody living there full time. I'm imagining somebody who owns a property and lives in Anchorage who for a spread out 2 months a year is renting it out short term. Maybe I'm not fully understanding the question.
Yeah, sorry. I think I'm referring to a unit that maybe is has been a long-term rental, a year-round rental, so not an owner-occupied rental. But I wonder if there's any research that you're aware of in other cities of that situation, where it basically an apartment becomes a short-term rental for some months of the year, and so it is not a full-year apartment anymore.
Got it. So I am not aware of research that indicates, I guess, what you would call like how often that happens. I would say there's not much research on the direct impact side that would evidence that STRs make up a significant impact. I think all you have to do is look at, I think, some larger jurisdictions that have enacted harsher regulations. You take San Francisco, for example, which has a famous housing shortage and I guess, government that has done very little to get housing built over a period of decades. In 2015, they enacted basically a primary residence requirement. So you could only rent out your primary residence, which I think ultimately cut the short-term rental population in half in the city. And as a result, rent prices continue to go up. Those units weren't particularly on the market as long-term rental options. I think a misconception there is that, you know, and I know this depends on the community, but that a short-term rental will, if not allowed to short-term rent, would go back onto the market as a long-term rental. And I think in the cases of people who are renting out their place for only 2 months a year, that's especially not true. And I think particularly for, you know, if we go more to those resort communities, again, smaller population, again, I'm imagining Deerwood here, like, these are more of the vacation rental style, and not as applicable to an affordable long-term housing option. But I am kind of paraphrasing a lot of studies out there. I'm happy to share with you all in more detail.
All right. Thank you. There may be some written questions for you later. I have a question. I have myself in the queue. And my question, it's interesting you brought up your voluntary collection agreement. As a legislator and an appropriator and someone who is responsible for ensuring that the audited financial statements of the municipality are true, I have had some heartburn over this voluntary collection agreement, which is, I think, one of the impetus factors of us even beginning to regulate short-term rentals, because there's no insight for us into who you're actually renting to or providing services for, who are renting to the community, who you're collecting from, or if in fact we are receiving the funds that we are due. And so when we asked the treasurer, the previous treasurer who recently retired, he said, we have a good relationship and we just trust them. And for me, I have a really hard time trusting a multinational corporation to do the right thing. And this is not a personal attack or anything.
Sure.
I use the service.
No, I hear what you're saying.
And so I want to understand the fidelity between what's transacted to us and what's actually happening out there.
Sure, I think as part of our, and I appreciate all of that and understand that concern. That's not, I don't feel attacked by that. It's an agreement that I think can sometimes be complicated, but the short version of it is that when, like physically, when somebody books an Airbnb on our platform in Anchorage, that tax is withdrawn from, like, it's part of their transaction. As like, if you go book an Airbnb in Anchorage right now, that tax will be part of the transaction. It will be held and it will be remitted to you, your treasurer. You know, I forget what the cadence is in the VCA, but so just from like a systems perspective, if you're concerned about things not being collected, if they are on our platform, it's an automatic collection. The other part of that is, and I know less about this, I'm not a tax professional, but I do work with the team quite a bit. You know, we have tools that we use with jurisdictions all the time to basically verify, you know, that amounts on our platform are being paid correctly. Your treasurer has the right to audit, and we're happy to provide more detail there. But I'm also happy to have a separate conversation about the tax collection component of this at a later date. But I will just say, I think driving jurisdictions towards agreements like the ones we have is something that I think makes a lot of sense, because the alternative is that, you know, we don't automatically remit to you all, and then you have to basically hire more people on the compliance side to verify that the right amounts are being paid, versus just coming back to us and us being able to check in with you about your concerns.
Right. What I just heard you say is that our treasurer has a right to audit. So he definitely didn't tell us that when we were asking him how he knows. And so that's an interesting factor. We have a conversation, if you're listening through the end of the meeting, with a third party operator who does analysis of actual use of the various platforms. And so that whole process we're in conversation about because we don't have insight into the actual use of properties, who is the taxpayer, all of that. So anyhow, thank you. I have Ms. Bronga in the queue.
I was wondering, and I may have missed it, but between VRBO and Airbnb, does anyone, I guess this is what you're trying to do, is find out how many are out there that are not in those platforms, but a lot of those short-term rental people are telling me you wouldn't get your place rented unless you were going through one of these platforms. So is there some number that you think you know?
So this next presentation with this third-party verification, I think will help answer some of those questions. It really kind of looks at beyond even just the two platforms, kind of everywhere people might list them, and then compliance with any local or state laws, so you can get a full picture. And then you can compare that to what you actually get for registrations. And so you can see if any registrations are missing, because that's the thing, right? Is how do you make sure you captured them all if they aren't using a major platform in particular, or if a new platform pops up?
I appreciate that. And I had one more thing that I wanted to ask, or maybe just a commentary if that's appropriate. But some of the things that are in this short-term rental ordinance about availability of management and whatnot would be completely awesome to put in long-term rentals as well. We certainly have a lot of long-term rental absentee landlords, and I think spreading this to them as well would look less punitive on the short-term rental group.
I don't. That's a whole lot to chew on. Thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Salatel.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn to Dustin. Dustin is on via Teams. He's from one of those third-party verification entities. Actually, when we were at National League of Cities, Mr. Constant and I got to see a quick preview of how this kind of product would work. And what we're hoping to do by sharing it is to see if there would be, if this were to pass, is there interest in having that kind of third-party verification to make sure of compliance. Right now, the ordinance is worded in such ways that the fees collected are for purposes of administering the program in addition to enforcement to ensure that everyone's registered. With that, Dustin, I'll turn it over to you. Sorry.
Yeah, before that, I think that it's if this passes or not, the third-party verification is an option the assembly can proceed for. So it's not tied to it. It's a funding question then.
Well, I think that's a conversation for after we get the result of the ordinance, because I'm not sure 100% what the third-party verification would do without something further. But Dustin, please go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. I appreciate all the time you spend. There we go. You're hearing me, I hope. I really appreciate all the time that was spent by Assembly Member Meg. You are amazing. So thank you for all of your time spent on this to bring this forward. What I would say is I really love to show a live demo of our system. I did prepare a PowerPoint for your viewing pleasure as well. I can roll through that real quickly, but if you'll humor me for about 2 or 3 minutes, I'd like to go through a live platform and show you the actual system in a live state and exactly what it looks like. Do you presently see the state of Alaska on your screen there in the chambers?
Yes.
Perfect.
Before you proceed, could I ask a quick question?
On a nationwide basis, we
I don't know if
actually
you
look
can
at
hear me.
over 10,000 short-term rental platforms every single day. So in the state of Alaska, these are all of the different platforms that we're out there touching on a every single night basis. And I already have some filters on. So there's 6,793 listings in the state of Alaska that are out there in the internet. And of course, over time, there has been other long-term rentals that have been on these short-term rental platforms. So there's been 21,000 listings out there. Hotels put themselves on there. Sometimes people put RVs on there and things like that. I do want to jump right into your local area because that's what's really important. There's been 4,169 listings, and that's advertisements over the last year that have been there in Anchorage. As you can see, some are long-term, some are short-term, and of course, Airbnb being the largest player in the marketplace, you've got Vrbo and Flipkey and Booking and Holiday Rentals by Owner, and I don't have to read to you. You can probably see Rent Like a Champion, My Alaska Getaways, and so forth. But one of the reasons that I wanted to show you this is that of that 4,169 listings that are live and have taken bookings over the last 365 days, I want to show you how many properties overall, and when we go in and take a look at a specific property, what we have. So my team went in and identified some of your properties just so that I can demonstrate this to you locally. And I'm going to click on a specific property. Now, I didn't do this because they're in trouble. I didn't do this because they're a good or a bad operator. I did it because they have several advertisements out there. They're on Vrbo, they're on Booking, they're on Vacasa, they are on Airbnb, and because we touch every single ad every single day, we know that this property at 150 Servan Circle in Girdwood is very active. We know that they've taken 175 nights worth of booking. So when you talk about that IRS law of 14 days or less, very important. We can exclude out those that don't rent over 14 days per year when you're looking at whether or not they need to have a permit or not. Now, all of this information on the calendar is very important. It's forward-looking, so we can see out into the future any booking that happens, and the color differentiation actually tells you when a booking takes place. So on January 13th of 24, someone booked the 5th through the 13th to stay at this property, and the list rate, approximate rate in the marketplace was $666 a night when that booking took place. If you go back and look in January, there were bookings that happened in November, and the rate was about $811, and we changed the color from booking to booking so that you can see that they are back-to-back bookings. This one was booked way back in July. Now, I don't want to get too far into the weeds here, but I did want to show you, it also shows, because we use the parcel number as a source of truth, we know that this owner of this property gets their property tax bill sent by your tax collector or assessor to their home in Monterey, California. So we already know who the owner of the property is, Allison Baker, and the fact that she's getting that bill at 15 Alta Mesa Circle in Monterey. So one of the beautiful things about it is we're tying all of that data directly back. This is not the type of information you'll ever get from Airbnb or Vrbo because of the privacy laws that they must acknowledge with their own internal clients. And that's why it's so difficult to audit or to be able to look at the detail of one property. Your treasurer may be able to audit the overall process, but they're never going to be able to see each individual property and what bookings happen at each property because of the privacy laws between the owner of the property and the host and the actual hosting platform. Now, one of the other great things is we track every text word in every single advertisement every single day. So we know this is a 4-bedroom, occupancy of 10, and then we track license numbers. So once we issue a license number, we will then be able to look at all those real text words and see whether they are putting their license number into the advertisement, and we can track on that for you and for your staff so that you have that. And we actually pick that out onto our map. I'll show you that in just a moment. One of the other sources of truth that we have is that we do a historical picture with a date stamp every single week on every single property. So this is just an example of a date stamp of a ad. And then of course we can look at every ad that they've ever had online, look at the Airbnb, look at each of the different ads, and we have a date stamp of it. So if you ever need proof, you've got the proof. Now, I am going to go back out to the map, but what I also want to do is I also want to go to an actual, another city. This is the city of Indio. I have full authorization from Jason Anderson at City of Indio to share their platform. As you can see, the blue dots on the map are identified short-term vacation rentals in Indio, California. The red dots are those that are presently unlicensed. And we've created all of these filters so that you can say, I just want to see the licensed properties, or I just want to see the unlicensed properties. So if staff came in for the day, I apologize, they could actually see there's only 109 properties that we need to pay attention to and either do a outreach campaign, which we could help with, doing that letter outreach, or being able to just drive people to get a permit, or it could be someone who has been discouraged from having a permit or been canceled in the past. We can flag all of that information for you with any type of violation that you wish to create locally in your jurisdiction. We
Dustin,
also have a robust.
Dustin,
Yes.
hi, this is Meg. We're gonna have to wrap up because we want to leave some room for questions. So can you, like, within a minute or two, get to a landing spot, and then I can turn it back over to the chair for questions from members?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I'll dive through this slide deck real quick, just to be able to show you a couple of things that I felt were really important in here. I'm going to cruise down to where I start to look at some of the jurisdictions that we work with. Big jurisdictions like Phoenix, Arizona, where they have 6,800 short-term rentals. This was actually the day I did your PowerPoint here. You had 4,200 active listings. Today it's 4,169. I also wanted to get into what the different host revenue had been, what we saw in the way of host revenue over the last 12 months, so rolling 12 months, and what that looks like in the way of the local information. I showed you in Indio what it looks like to see the red and the blue dots, but I wanted to show you in City of San Diego how that zeroes in, and you can look at a neighborhood and see where the properties are, which ones are permitted, which ones are not permitted. There are best practices in setting up this type of system because there are 5 operators out there. There's Sally Dogood that probably is 50% of your people that will come and get registered on day 1 and have already been asking staff, how do I get registered? And then there are those that are a little more Clueless Craig, Busy Bob, Dodgy Dave, and Notorious Nick, who I've named all 5 of these people, and the only difficult ones to get registered are number 4 and 5. Number 1 through 3 are normally 90% of your population, which will never be a problem. Once they know exactly what to do, it's a simple and easy registration process. They'll go through that process and they'll get registered locally, so that then you have the opportunity to make sure that you know who that emergency contact is, what their cell phone is, what their email is, so that you can contact them in case of an emergency, just like your best practice that you had said. The only thing that I will point out that I think is a best practice, and Airbnb and Vrbo do this all the time, and so do the other platforms, is that you should require or mandate that the registration number, the permit number, the license number that's issued by the city, either through our platform or however you wish to do that, is always in the advertisement in order to be put online. We can track in the ads whether they're putting an ad, a license number, whether they're putting the wrong license number, whether they're putting someone else's license number, or if they're leaving it completely blank. So all of that is trackable. It is all about big data and being able to look deep into that big data.
Thanks, Dustin.
I apologize for going over a little bit, so I'm going to bring it back to you.
Thank you. That way, we'd love to turn over to the chair and answer any questions. And for any of our speakers, I believe we have everyone still on the line.
Yeah, thanks. So you presented that there are 4,200 or 4,169 listings, but can you deduplicate that for us? Because we have reporters here, we have people here who are going to immediately turn to, there are 4,200 operating Airbnbs or, short-term rentals in town. But I know that's not true. What is the number you
You're
guys?
absolutely correct, Chair. You're absolutely correct. So we saw last month, or at your peak of your market, we saw 1,800 property owners that took a booking. That does not mean that seasonality wise, you don't have more than 1,800, but 1,801 actually is the maximum number of properties that have taken a booking in one single month. So you might have at a maximum somewhere around 2,000 short-term rental properties throughout all of Anchorage, Alaska.
Well, I wish the tax assessor was still here. We could ask him the question, how many properties do we have that serve? So we need to get that question answered so we can understand. And then there are members of the Girdwood community who would like to know in our community, how many of those specific deduplicated numbers might there be? Can you by chance do that? I know that's a level in the weeds, but.
Can we get it and bring it off?
Yeah, we actually have to really address map every single property in order to deduplicate them. And that's why I had my team go in and do a sampling for you.
Mhm.
But we would definitely do that during our process.
If we're in a
And
contract.
my
Okay.
assumption
Thank
at
you.
this point, off of everything else in the nation, wherever we've done it, is that you'll have somewhere between 1,800 and 2,000 total properties for all of those 4,000 plus listings.
I got you. There's a more specific question we can put in writing and get it from you later. And then one last part, your revenues looked really weird on the one listing you showed us. It showed $660 or $880. It showed 175 nights a year, but it showed $12,300 of revenue. Those numbers don't,
Yes, the revenue was just last month's revenue. sir.
okay, it was a month's revenue. It didn't say that. Okay, thank
It
you.
was.
Now, Mr. Cross.
Thank you. I don't know to be impressed or startled with the amount of information he's able to draw and put there. And I guess I can sum it up with big data. I have to weigh that against what I swore when I came as assemblyman against protecting the constitutional rights of individuals. The fact in a public session, we just brought up somebody's name and address and where they live, makes me want to immediately go out, move all my properties into an LLC, either in Nevada, Delaware, New Mexico, or Wyoming, and make sure you never can find me. Because that's startling. We're not here to generate tax revenue through short-term rentals. We're here to protect people's constitutional and private property rights. That's what we do as an assembly. And that was, I'm rather startled. As far as the insurance requirement, to the sponsors, your mortgage company or your property requires you to notify them of property insurance. If you make a claim on a property where you're short-term renting it, and they will search the VRBO. And if you have a short-term rental property and you haven't notified your insurance carrier, you're not covered. I think some of these things are being covered. We've got it under the platform. I will close in this because I know we're short on time. Has anybody here owned or ran an Airbnb? Okay, good. Because I had 10 of them at one point. You know what the biggest deterrent to running Airbnbs is? Owning Airbnbs is the biggest deterrent. Like, oh my gosh. And so, I mean, part of that is just the public going out there and realizing they're taking on a second full-time job, because I know you thought you had dinner with your wife at 4 p.m., but you find out the house cleaner didn't show up. You're a house cleaner with 20 minutes notice, and that's what you're doing that evening. And so part of that just happens that there's the dream of what it looks like, then there's a reality of practical application. But what I ended with this is, why do Airbnbs succeed, or why are they so profitable? We have a housing shortage. What was the housing shortage created by? Title 21 and Title 23 issues, and we basically made small properties hard to do. We overregulated our housing into non-existence. We bought hotels in order to do that, so we created more opportunity for Airbnbs, and we're solving the problems created by overregulation by more regulation.
Thank you. So I have a couple of people in the queue. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to raise a couple general questions that I'm going to keep chewing on, but I do have a question for the sponsors, broad one. One is, I keep chewing on the policy implications of using residential property for business purposes. So we've built our tax structure, our property tax structure, our zoning code, a lot of those things on the idea that we separate residential and commercial property. And I'm not advocating that that was a good idea. There's a lot of implications there, but I do want to note that essentially what we're doing is allowing people to use their property and then potentially still having the tax breaks for owner occupied property. So again, I just want to raise that as something for folks to think about. Another one is, when you create a license, I've dealt enough with licensing that I know that's a whole ball of wax. So I'm not opposed to that idea, because I do see the value in it. But I do think about the fact that licenses can become quasi property rights. And so I am concerned about that as well, especially if they become transferable, or in the future if they're ever limited. So this ordinance, just to be clear, does not put a limit on them. But it is something to think about when you create licensing, and it's something I'm concerned about. But my question for the sponsors in general, again, thinking about licensing, I'm curious if you guys could talk a little about your general approach or philosophy of how not restrictive, but how detailed to be in your licensing regulations, because I think on the one hand, we could create a license with no regulations that isn't maybe helpful. On the other hand, I wonder how much some of these rules in here are good practices, and then how much you put them in code, because the code creates a floor. So I guess I'm just curious your guys' approach on that thought.
Thanks for that. I'll start and I'll have Mr. Stolt jump in. So short-term rentals basically sprung up, and there's a donut hole in our regulations around them. And in a lot of ways, other than not being owner occupied or requiring breakfast, they're like a bed and breakfast, which is subject to a lot of these same requirements. And so for me, kind of leveling the playing field a bit between the two is really where I was starting. Also, we have two community conversations going on. We have short-term rentals are the end of the world and something needs to be done. And then we have short-term rentals are contributing to our economy, particularly for tourism, right? And in order to start to drill down on some version of what is the effect of short-term rentals, we wanted to start to get an accurate picture of the short-term rentals and have there be some way to ensure that when someone is staying at a short-term rental, that short-term rental doesn't somehow detriment the overall neighborhood or neighbors, right? Because there's no follow through there's no requirements for a short-term rental. Hard stop in our community. So kind of taking a number of competing community interests as well as seeing how these sit as compared to bed and breakfasts is where I started. Mr. Stolt.
Thank you. In relation to the business use, yes, we are operating a business in a residential neighborhood. I guess the solace is that you pay a bed tax. We're trying to make this AO or this process not restrictive again. We're trying to collect data to see if there's a problem. And I think we've done a pretty good job of removing any type of restriction or limitation and keeping it to the data collection component and to the ability to enforce municipal code should we have a renter or an owner that violates it. Thank you.
Mr. Volland.
Thank you. I appreciate all the presentations. Framing short-term rentals as a business, I think is interesting for a couple of reasons. Number one, if you put your business, if you put advertisements online, that is public. Basically, if you put anything on the internet, it becomes public. But also with that framing, long-term rentals could also be considered a business. I'm curious if, so does your, I'm sorry, what was the name of the software? Yeah, Dustin. Okay, Dustin, does your software, does it look at things like Furnished Finder or Facebook Marketplace?
So that's a great question. We look at all of the major platforms that are out there and any local property managers that might have their own properties. Facebook Marketplace is very interesting in that you are not allowed to scrape Facebook as a user because of the privacy laws. So we do not break any laws. Everything that we are looking at is public domain information that does not have any password security where you actually have to enter with a password to get in and be able to utilize or look at that data. So going on to Facebook and utilizing Facebook information is not a best practice. And so we adhere to the law and make sure that we're looking at things on a grand spectrum in the way of everything that is in the public domain out there on the World Wide Web.
Thanks. And then I have another question for the sponsors, but I'll kind of use an anecdote. So I bought my duplex a couple years ago. Had two long-term tenants who were awesome. One was a speech therapist and the other one was a planner. They moved out because they were looking for something a little bit bigger. You know, they started collecting more Alaskan gear, pack rafts and skis, etc. So they needed more storage room. Very sad to see them go because they were wonderful. And now I have two new long-term tenants, married couple. He's clerking for one of our judges. She works remotely in international policy, young couple, again, very awesome tenants. But in the interim between the previous tenants moving out and the new ones moving in, I used that unit as a short-term rental. And I had hosted 3 different guests. And part of it was just I wanted to experiment with it and see what it was like because I knew this kind of stuff was coming. And I was like, okay, well, what does it take to like hire a cleaner and go through all this process? And I just thought it would be an interesting experiment. But yeah, it was just interesting for me as the landlord to use that as the bridge between long-term tenants, but also the folks who are living in the other unit now, they Airbnb'd when they first moved here while they were waiting for my unit to open up. And so I think that there is an important role for short-term rentals to kind of bridge those housing gaps. And to that end, that leads to my question for the sponsors is when we're looking at the exemptions to the fees, I was wondering why you guys settled on 180 days, because I guess I think of anything longer than a month as not really a short-term rental, but more like a mid-term rental.
So though that's for having you living owner occupancy. So 180 days for owner occupancy is consistent with the PFD qualification and other, like you are a resident of Anchorage if you stay in your home for 180 days. You are exempt from the fee, I believe, and we'll be bringing this amendment, we will waive it for homeowners who rent less than 14 days consistent with the IRS regulation. So if you had rented in that interim time period, 14 days or less, we wouldn't charge you a fee, right? And then you are considered owner occupied if you are renting and you stay in your primary residence 180 days or more. Does that make sense? I need to make a chart, I presume.
The license fee established in this section shall be waived where the short-term rental unit is the applicant's primary residence. So I understand that. So that would be like I'm renting out a room or I'm gone less than the first. Okay. And then resides on site or the premises. So like as the owner, to bring it back to me, as a duplex owner, I reside on site, so I would be exempt. Resides in an immediately adjacent property. So if I lived in the single family home next to my duplex, I would still be exempt if I was using a unit in the duplex as a short-term rental. Okay. And then I'm just walking through just to make sure I understand all of this. And then or is rented out to a single guest for an aggregate of more than 180 days of the previous 12 months. I guess that's what I don't quite understand. Can you elucidate that for me?
Yeah, and I think that that's a point of conversation, right? So 180 days again would be someone saying, I'm a resident, I'm here, it's long-term. You could possibly exempt those that were under leases, right? Because if you weren't collecting bed tax, then I think there's this conversation is it being used as a short-term rental? Here's the thing though, that's whether or not you're subject to the fee for the registration, doesn't mean that you're not using it as a short-term rental otherwise, right? So this gives you the option to spend about half the year in a long-term rental for like a summer worker and then do short-term rental in the winter or something like that. So we're trying to create the largest menu of options that encourages owner occupancy and some long-term renters, balanced with the fact that it wouldn't necessarily preclude a short-term rental from occurring.
Okay, so if you have a tenant that's there for 180 days collectively, oh, got it. And then, okay, so then, and then, oh,
If you also, if Dean's there, I can't see if Dean's there, but you could weigh in. If you stay for more than 30 days, you lose a long-term rental period. And at which point, because I've done this with hotels before personally, you don't get a bed tax, I believe, at that point. So I think Dean might go weigh in on the 30-day rental piece.
okay, no, that actually answers my question, I think, Mr. Salt. Okay.
All right.
Unless Dean wants to weigh in, but that's great.
We have a couple more folks in the queue still. Mr. Martinez, and we're pretty much out of time. So.
All right, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points and a question for the sponsors. Yay, data. So good on data. As a stickler of wanting to see data, and I think that's a really good presentations today. And thank you for the data to all the folks who presented. I'm left curious with a few wonderings of whether we're attempting to solve a problem or we're attempting to learning data. And it was described that we're learning, but there seems to be some proactive steps toward a value proposition of some attempted problem solving. And on that front, I'm just curious to the sponsors. It was described by Member Salt that the fee structure in this ordinance is to basically pay for itself. Okay. And I just don't know the answer to this. It's not a setup question unless it falls that way. Do we do comparative, is there other comparisons with other sectors that we initiate a fee for data collection independent of taxes or other structures, regulatory?
Great question. So we worked with council. We looked at what it would take for possible administration of the licensing scheme, and we put it at, I believe, Dean, you'll have to remind me, but 1 to 1.5 FTE. And so the statement of economic effect breaks down how we got to the fee. And so it's not only to register the properties, it's for any enforcement, follow-up communication. And then as Mr. Soul indicated, that we'll ask for a report out of the clerk's office of like, how's it going and what are the actual costs we're charging against the program, against the fee collected. We are mindful of the BSSA, and we don't want to end up in a hole where we create something that's supposed to pay for ourselves and we undercut that. So we've taken some educated guesses at what it will actually cost to administer this and try to ease the burden on the clerk's office, particularly for enforcement.
Thank you. Are there other industries or sectors that we follow a similar process with respect to regulatory fees over and above the other taxes they may charge?
Yeah, I believe both alcohol and marijuana licensure is meant to basically pay for the cost of the program. Thank you.
Right, so I have myself and Ms. Brawley in the queue. Most of the time, or often, I would be in the same spot you are, Mr. Cross, thinking about privacy issues. But like Mr. Martinez said, this information is all in the public domain. These are listings and advertisements, taxable services. It's like all, like to me, squarely in the Venn diagram of public information. Mrs. Zalatel, you said there are two facets to the timber of this conversation. The end of the world is coming because of short-term rentals, and it's good for tourism. There's a third, and that's not such a big deal. I don't really care, but I have a duty to look at this. This is not an area. But to your point, and also to your point, Ms. Zalatel, about why would we have just the data if the ordinance didn't pass? I think you put it very well to suggest that there are two arguments happening here. One is an argument about learning the nature of the problem or the system that exists. And then the second one is setting some rules and parameters around the use of that system because ... it's good for tourism. It's bad. It's the end of the world of our communities or whatever. And so to me, the value of the data system is to answer the preliminary question that I have always had. What is the actual nature and impact of these units in our community? Like how many are there? Where are they at? And are they actually creating a problem as opposed to us solving a problem that we perceive exists because we've heard broadly from a number of people? And so I am really stuck in the data piece. I don't know the answer to, is this a real problem yet or not? And so I just want to put out there that data is valuable to me. Understanding 1,800 units in the muni is, if we can get to a really dialed in number, that's great. If we could get to that dialed in number in Girdwood, that would be great. Because my analysis, I think, undershot, other analyses overshot, and it would be nice to have data. So for my part, whether this passes or not, I am still very much interested in getting the data on this. And I want folks to know that I'm not sold on the ordinance. So for the members in your contemplations, know that this isn't something that is broadly or not broadly supported. It's an open question before the body. Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. Just briefly, I'll say I come at this from a business licensing perspective. That's the lens I'm going to be reading this S version more closely. And I did have a quick question. So you mentioned exemption from fees. Is there any categorical exemption for someone operating a short-term rental under any circumstances that would not be required to be licensed?
I'd have to go look. I'm sorry. But we talked about making sure that we got all short-term rentals licensed, and then it was whether or not there was a fee associated with it. If my memory is wrong, Mr. Solt or Mr. Gates should tell me that I'm wrong.
That is my recollection.
Okay, thank you. And I appreciate that, because when you create a situation where there are unlicensed folks, that is the problem. And so I appreciate that. Again, I'm going to be reading this. And then again, I just want to also say, because I'm going to say it every time we talk about bed tax and rentals, the customer pays the bed tax. So I know sometimes businesses will say, we're paying the tax. And I appreciate that a lot of the conversation has been, we're remitting the tax, we're collecting the tax and paying it. But bottom line is, it is a type of sales tax and the customer pays the tax. It is not something a business directly pays. And I say that because I've heard that a whole lot with other taxes. And I just want to make that clear for members. Thanks.
Ms. Altzel.
Thank you. I want to say one last thing as we close here. For me, something like this ordinance is the start of having a different conversation. If Girdwood wants area-specific things, to me, you have to have the underlying process that's municipal-wide, in my viewpoint, before you can, and getting that information before you can contemplate overlay districts or area-specific rules. It's kind of a fundamental principle of mine. And so this could, if it passes, open up that potential conversation after it's been in place for a while and we actually know what's happening. So I want to thank you all for great participation today. This reminds me of kind of how we used to bat around ordinances, and it's fun. Thanks.
Thank you. So AO 2023-110 and 110S, an ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code Title 10 to add a new chapter for the licensing and regulation of short-term rental operations. The municipality and amending AMC Section 14.60.030. The municipal fine schedule to add corresponding fines will be before the assembly, or at least the public hearing will be before the assembly on Tuesday, the 23rd. So with that, we'll adjourn and take a 5-minute break.